Welcome back. Today, we're looking at what happened when gym influencers tried climbing Everest and how every one of them ended up dead. From 3 fitness influencers who treated Everest like just another hike and froze to death, to 2 men who mocked their Sherpas' warnings during a live stream. These are the fatal mistakes that proved physical strength alone isn't enough to survive the world's highest mountain. It was April 28, 2015. The Khumbu Valley was still unsettled. 3 days earlier, the Gorkha earthquake had torn through Nepal and sent shockwaves up the mountain that scattered teams, collapsed sections of the icefall, and killed climbers at base camp. But higher on the mountain, above the immediate chaos, a narrow weather window had cracked open. A handful of teams were still moving, and one climber in particular was moving fast. Not because of the window, but because of someone else. Zoran Ashby was the kind of guy who turned everything into a competition. 27 years old, fitness creator, built his whole channel around one idea, that most people are just soft. No excuses, no rest days, no slow and steady. He had learned sometime before the summit push that another creator he had publicly positioned himself against was on the mountain with a separate expedition and was ahead of him in acclimatization rotations. So Zoran pushed for the summit after completing only one rotation to Camp 2 instead of the standard 2. His expedition leader flagged it. Zoran said he felt fine. He had summited peaks up to 6,400 meters before, never anything close to Everest, and I think he genuinely believed his fitness would cover the gap. That's the thing about the mountain. It doesn't care how strong you are. Here's something most people don't think about when it comes to high-altitude climbing. Acclimatization isn't optional, it's biological. Your body needs time to adjust to the drop in oxygen pressure, and there's no shortcut for that process, regardless of fitness level. Skip the rotations, and you're essentially rolling the dice on whether your body can cope with what's coming. The symptoms of a body that can't cope start subtle. A cough, some breathlessness, fatigue, easy to dismiss, easy to push through if pushing through is your whole identity. The problem is that above 23,000 feet, subtle doesn't stay subtle for long. At Camp 3, 24,500 feet, Zoran developed a persistent cough he told his Sherpa was just the dry air. His expedition doctor at base camp picked up on something during a radio check and recommended he descend for observation. Zoran declined. He cited his rival's position on the mountain. That night he slept badly, and by morning his lips had taken on a faint bluish tint his Sherpa recognized immediately. Reminds me of other cases I've covered where everyone around the victim saw it, coming before the victim did. And still, he packed up and pushed toward Camp 4. At what point do you stop calling it confidence and start calling it something else? He didn't make it far. Within 2 hours of leaving Camp 3, he had fallen well behind the group. The Sherpa behind him noted his pace had become slow and irregular. His breathing had changed too. The Sherpa could hear it, a wet crackling sound with each exhale, the kind that doesn't come from dry air or exertion. At around 25,800 feet, he stopped moving and sat down on his pack. His Sherpa reached him within minutes. Zoran was conscious but confused. Couldn't answer what day it was. Couldn't track a simple question. His oxygen saturation read 48% on the Sherpa's pulse oximeter. To put that in context, a healthy person at sea level sits around 95 to 99%. Even accounting for altitude, 48% is critical. Fluid had filled a significant portion of both lungs. He could not stand without help. 2 Sherpas began a new, immediate descent with him, supported between them. He lost consciousness before they had covered much ground. CPR was performed on the slope for 14 minutes. He didn't respond. 14 minutes on a near vertical slope at 25,000 feet. I want you to think about what that actually looks like. Base camp was notified and a helicopter evacuation was requested, but weather conditions in the valley, still unstable in the days following the earthquake, made a high-altitude extraction impossible that morning. The team held position for 2 hours before confirming he had no pulse. His body was evacuated by helicopter 2 days later when conditions finally allowed it. I've covered deaths that were sudden and deaths that were slow. This one sits somewhere uncomfortable in between because there was a clear window where he could have turned around and chose not to. The postmortem confirmed bilateral pulmonary edema as cause of death. Both lungs had accumulated fluid, consistent with rapid ascent without adequate acclimatization. His camera was recovered at Camp 3. The last thing on it was a clip filmed the morning of his final push. him visibly struggling to finish sentences, breathless between every few words. The expedition's radio logs confirmed the descent recommendation had been issued and declined roughly 18 hours before he died. The case was ruled accidental, with self-directed deviation from the acclimatization protocol listed as the primary contributing factor. Zoran had spent years telling his audience that the body could handle anything if the mind was strong enough. Everest answered that one for him. It was May 18, 2017. Summit season on Everest was at its peak, and climbers crowded the southeast ridge, waiting for a narrow weather window. Temperatures above 26,000 feet dropped below 25 degrees. Wind pushed loose snow across the fixed rope lines. From lower on the mountain, the line of headlamps moving upward looked almost calm. But once climbers entered the death zone, almost everybody up there was struggling, whether they admitted it or not. Chad Walker was 30 years old, a fitness coach from Utah. Luke Keaton, 31, worked as a personal trainer and former amateur wrestler. Cameron Ford, 29, worked at construction and competed in endurance races during the off-season. The three had gained a small following online by posting fitness challenges, mountain training, and endurance-focused content. Their social media presence was built on a simple message: hard work beats everything. Suffer more than the next guy. Push through the pain. Their content showed ice baths at 5 a.m., weighted stair climbs, mountain trail sprints, and recovery metrics posted like athletic scorecards. They were the kind of guys their followers looked at and thought, if anyone can do this, it's them. Before Everest, they had completed guided climbs on Kilimanjaro and Aconcagua, along with winter mountaineering courses in Colorado. They spent months training for the expedition through strength workouts, long stair sessions with weighted pack, altitude mask, conditioning, and strict meal plans. Together, they spent nearly $80,000 preparing for the climb with professional gear, oxygen systems, expedition support, and custom cold weather equipment. The problem wasn't that they failed to prepare. The problem was they trained for Everest like it was an athletic challenge instead of a survival environment. Chad, Luke, and Cameron were climbing with a commercial expedition, supported by Sherpa guides and the fixed rope infrastructure that most South Col summit attempts rely on. The structure gave them experienced support on the mountain, but it also gave them another reason not to worry. Commercial expeditions have made Everest more accessible than it was a generation ago, but accessible doesn't mean safe. The three arrived at base camp as a unit, but the mountain exposed them as individuals, and each one cracked differently. Chad's problem was control. He was the de facto leader of the group, and he processed the altitude the way he processed everything, as a management problem. When his body gave him bad information, he overrode it with logic. When a Sherpa told him the group needed more rest, Chad filed it away as a difference of opinion rather than expert advice. He wasn't reckless. He was methodical about the wrong things. He tracked metrics, built schedules, and kept morale high with exactly the kind of thinking that works at sea level and kills you at 28,000 feet. Luke's problem was attention. He was the most technically careful of the three under normal conditions, obsessive about gear checks, oxygen saturation readings, recovery data. But hypoxia specifically degrades the kind of focused, sequential thinking that careful technical work requires. The mountain targeted the thing Luke relied on most. By summit day, the same hands that had clipped and unclipped safety lines hundreds of times during the expedition were fumbling the same motions twice, then stopping to stare at hardware he'd used without thinking for 2 months. His brain had turned his greatest strength into a liability. Cameron's problem was physical. He was probably the strongest of the three at lower elevations. He handled load carries better than anyone nearby and almost never complained. But raw physical capacity adapts to altitude differently than cardiovascular fitness, and Cameron's body responded worse than the others as elevation increased. He kept interpreting exhaustion as a temporary state rather than a signal. He had spent years training himself to push through discomfort. Everest gave him discomfort. He was physically incapable of pushing through, and the training made him slow to recognize the difference. Understanding those three failure patterns matters, because on the descent, each man deteriorated in exactly the way the mountain had been telegraphing for weeks. At base camp, the three quickly became known for their energy. While most climbers rested during acclimatization days, Chad organized group gear sessions and kept morale high with commentary about discipline and delayed gratification. Luke tracked calorie intake, oxygen saturation, resting heart rate, and recovery metrics on his watch, and shared daily summaries with the others. Cameron volunteered to carry heavier loads between camps because he genuinely believed suffering at lower altitude translated directly into performance higher up. A lot of first-time Everest climbers believe being in great shape is enough to handle most of the mountain's dangers. Early in the expedition, Chad, Luke, and Cameron Cameron looked stronger than almost everyone around them. During their first acclimatization rotation through the Khumbu icefall, they crossed aluminum ladders suspended over deep crevasses with confidence, while many other climbers moved slowly and cautiously across them, one careful step at a time. The icefall did what it always does to fit confident climbers. It confirmed everything they already believed about themselves. They moved through it faster than most, and that speed felt like evidence. It wasn't. The icefall is technical and dangerous, but it doesn't tell you anything about what your body will do above 26,000 feet. The climbers who moved slowly through it that morning weren't weaker. They were conserving something Chad, Luke, and Cameron were already spending. Chad hated slow movement. Whenever traffic opened ahead of him, he pushed forward aggressively instead of settling into the steady, deliberate pacing that experienced climbers practice almost obsessively at altitude. Luke joked that the climb felt like Zone 2 cardio near Camp 2 and laughed about how much older climbers prioritized recovery days. Cameron was quietly dealing with the first signs that his body was adapting worse than he expected. He just didn't say anything about it. By the second acclimatization rotation above Camp 2, warning signs had already started appearing. Nothing dramatic, just small problems stacking together. Cameron sweating excessively during climbs, despite freezing temperatures. Luke repeatedly removing gloves too long while adjusting gear because he hated losing dexterity. Chad trying to maintain pace uphill instead of conserving energy during steeper sections. Experienced climbers noticed the difference immediately. The three looked strong while moving, but their recovery after reaching camp looked poor compared to climbers who were pacing themselves more carefully. At Camp 2, while other climbers spent afternoons resting quietly inside tents, Chad organized equipment checks and kept the group in planning mode rather than recovery mode. Luke filmed short clips about discipline. Cameron quietly struggled to eat because his appetite had started declining, a known warning sign at altitude that he attributed to adjusting to the food. Acclimatization rotations exist for one reason: to force the body to produce more red blood cells before the real climb begins. Climbers go up, stress the system, come back down to recover, then go higher. Done properly, it's the closest thing the body has to genuine preparation for the death zone. Done impatiently, rushed, shortened, interrupted by extra load carries, it leaves far less reserve than it appears to. Chad, Luke, and Cameron completed the rotations. They just didn't treat them as the serious work they were. Above 21,000 feet, sleep became difficult for all three, but differently. Luke started waking repeatedly during the night, gasping for air, his body struggling to pull in enough oxygen, even while lying still. Cameron lost his appetite almost completely and forced himself to eat because guides kept warning climbers about the calorie deficits that accelerate deterioration at altitude. Chad physically handled the early altitude better, but he processed exhaustion as a mental obstacle rather than a physiological one. When his body told him to stop, he told himself that was what the training was for. During another acclimatization rotation toward Camp 3, Chad repeatedly shortened rest breaks because he believed stopping too long broke rhythm and killed momentum. Cameron carried extra camera gear higher on the route because he calculated the weight difference as negligible. Luke was meticulous about his oxygen saturation readings, but interpreted declining numbers as temporary rather than cumulative at sea level. Those were the habits that made them good at what they did. At 24,000 feet, everything matters. By then, Luke was getting headaches almost every day above camp. Cameron looked more exhausted after each rotation, and other climbers had started noticing Chad breathing hard, even while standing still. One of the expedition's Sherpa guides pulled Chad aside after the Camp 3 rotation and told him directly that the group needed more rest days before attempting the summit. That pushing harder at altitude wasn't the same as pushing harder at sea level. Chad listened carefully, said the group felt strong, and told him they'd been building toward this for 2 years. He nodded, said they'd reassess in the morning, and walked back to his tent. The guide didn't follow. On Everest, you can tell someone the truth, and they can choose not to hear it. And there is nothing left to do after that. The days between the Camp 3 rotation and the summit push were the quietest of the expedition. Most climbers used them to rest, eat, and sleep as much as the altitude allowed. Chad used them to prepare. He reviewed oxygen flow rates, confirmed gear configurations, and kept the group mentally locked in on the window. To anyone watching, it looked like focus. It was also the last opportunity to honestly assess whether they were ready, and nobody took it. When the forecast finally came through, Chad read it twice and sat quietly for a moment. Then he told the others they were going. Everyone seemed to know what the answer would be before he said it. Cameron nodded. Luke started going through his gear, and within minutes they were preparing for the climb. After 2 years of planning and training, the decision itself was surprisingly simple. By mid-May, weather forecasts finally opened a narrow summit window. Expeditions throughout the mountain began preparing for summit attempts. Camp 4 on the South Col filled with climbers, sorting oxygen systems, melting snow for water, and trying unsuccessfully to rest before departure. Camp 4 sits at roughly 26,000 feet. Even resting there feels horrible. People cough constantly because the air is painfully dry and cold. Oxygen masks hiss softly in dark tents all night while wind slams against fabric walls hard enough to shake entire campsites. Boots freeze solid outside sleeping bags. Most climbers barely sleep at all. Chad kept morale high that evening. He reminded the group what they'd invested to get here. It was exactly the kind of thing that sounds like leadership in a gym locker room and sounds like a warning sign at 26,000 feet. By then, the mountain had already worn them down badly. Luke forced himself to eat before departure because nausea had been building for days. Cameron sat breathing heavily while organizing oxygen cylinders. His rest heart rate, if he checked it, would have told him something his mind was refusing to process. Chad moved constantly around camp despite obvious exhaustion, running the same mental override he'd been running for weeks. Nobody slept much before the summit push. Cameron lay still inside his sleeping bag and noticed his legs were already cramping. He hadn't even started climbing yet. Luke checked his oxygen regulator twice before putting it down, picked it up and checked it again. Not because he suspected a problem, but because checking things was the only thing that still felt like control. Chad stared at the tent fabric and thought about the plan. The plan was solid. The plan had always been solid. That's the last thing he was certain of before the alarm went off. At approximately 9:30 p.m. on May 18th, the three left Camp 4 with their climbing team. Temperature outside hit roughly 30-degree Fahrenheit with wind chill before midnight. Every breath through the oxygen masks sounded mechanical, rhythmic, like something running on a timer, which in a sense, it was. Each oxygen cylinder carried roughly 8 to 10 hours of supply at standard summit flow rates. The clock had been running since the moment they left camp. The climb immediately slowed everyone into a long, single-file line, clipped into fixed ropes, running across steep ice and exposed rock. Climbers stopped every few steps just to catch their breath. Within the first hour above Camp 4, Cameron had already fallen behind the pace of the group. Chad stayed close to the fixed rope and kept glancing back. Luke moved steadily, but said nothing. The confidence of base camp was completely gone. Up here, there was only the rope, the next step, and the sound of their own breathing inside the masks. Around midnight, climbers approached the balcony at approximately 27,500 feet, the standard stop for oxygen cylinder exchanges. Traffic bottlenecks had already formed. Dozens of climbers stood clipped into ropes, waiting silently in freezing wind. Cameron sat through the oxygen change longer than he should have. Chad got him back on his feet. Luke, struggling to reconnect a carabiner with stiffening fingers, clipped the same rope section twice before confirming it. It was a small mistake, but Everest accidents usually start with small mistakes piling up over time. Above the balcony, movement became slower and steeper toward the south summit. By approximately 3 a.m., early descending climbers were already warning about dangerous traffic higher on the ridge and discussing turnaround considerations. Chad's position on the summit timeline, they were close enough to continue. The south summit was visible. The actual summit was not. Between them sat the Hillary Step and several hundred more feet of exposed ridge. In the dark, with hypoxia narrowing everything down to the next few steps. That distance is almost impossible to judge accurately. Most serious mountaineers hold to a hard turnaround time, often around 1 p.m., after which they descend regardless of how close the summit appears. The rule exists because the summit is only half the climb. The longer climbers stay in the death zone, the harder the descent becomes. But turning around after years of preparation, $80,000 spent, and hours already climbing through darkness feels psychologically impossible. That's the trap, and the mountain doesn't care about any of it. The three reached the summit at approximately 11:20 a.m. on May 19th, more than an hour past the turnaround time most expedition guides were enforcing that season. The summit photos told their own story without narration. Ice-covered portions of masks and outer suits. Cameron sat directly in the snow, unable to remain standing, his head tilted slightly forward, chin toward his chest. Chad and Luke stood beside him. Nobody raised their arms. Nobody celebrated. They stayed on the summit for roughly 15 minutes. By the time descent began at approximately 11:35 a.m., they had already spent more than 14 hours above 26,000 feet. The climb down immediately felt worse. People assume the hard part is climbing upward, but descent begins when the body is already exhausted, dehydrated, and slowly shutting down. Hypoxia has been compounding for hours. Judgment is compromised in ways the climber cannot detect. The mind wanders, attention drifts, small errors accumulate. Traffic near the Hillary step created another bottleneck on the way down. Climbers moved through one at a time, while wind pushed hard across the exposed ridge. For someone still physically intact, the wait was miserable. For Chad, Luke, and Cameron, standing motionless in that wind, after 14 hours above 26,000 feet, it was the kind of delay the body doesn't come back from. Every minute spent standing still in that cold meant losing body heat that wouldn't come back, burning oxygen the cylinders couldn't replace, and draining energy the body had no way to restore. Chad kept pushing for urgency. Luke and Cameron slowed noticeably behind him. At 8,000 meters, determination can't make exhausted legs move any faster. Cameron deteriorated the way his body had been threatening to since Camp 3, suddenly and completely. Around 1:45 p.m., he sat beside the fixed rope line near the south summit and stayed there, not pausing to rest, just stopped, staring down slope. Each time Chad pulled him upright, Cameron walked a few steps and sat down again. His body had reached a threshold that no amount of will was going to move. Chad kept going back. The pattern repeated itself all afternoon. Cameron stopped, and Chad went back for him. The distance to Camp 4 never seemed to get any smaller. At some point, it became clear that Chad was spending energy faster than he could recover it, while Cameron was losing strength faster than Chad could help him regain it. The wind was picking up, and the light was beginning to fade. Chad either couldn't see what was happening, or couldn't bring himself to accept it. At 28,000 feet, those are often the same thing. Luke deteriorated differently. In the precise, technical way that hypoxia had been targeting all expedition, he would clip into a fixed rope section, pause, stare at the hardware, and clip again, not certain whether he'd done it correctly the first time. He removed his gloves to work the equipment, and then struggled to replace them. The careful, sequential thinking he relied on was the first thing the altitude had taken from him. Chad held together longest but deteriorated in the way his failure pattern always suggested, by not accepting what was in front of him. He kept telling Cameron they just needed to get lower. He kept telling Luke the body recovers fast once you descend. He probably believed it. The brain at that altitude reaches for the most optimistic explanation available. That's not weakness. It's what hypoxia does to a mind that has spent years training itself to override discomfort. Around 3 p.m., another descending climber noticed ice building heavily around Cameron's oxygen mask valve and stopped briefly to clear it. He urged all three men to keep moving downhill before continuing his own descent. Stopping in that wind costs body heat that cannot be replaced. At that altitude, people pass others who are dying and keep moving, not because they are indifferent, but because stopping means dying alongside them. By then, they were dehydrated badly. Water bottles had partially frozen. None of them had eaten properly for hours. Leg muscles cramped during descent while crampon points snagged fixed rope sections beneath drifting snow. Chad's relentlessness at altitude had never been theatrical. It was methodical, quiet, and persistent. At every stop on the descent, he climbed back toward Cameron, pulled him to his feet, and tried to get him moving downhill again. He kept his voice measured. He kept the plan simple. Reach Camp 4. He did this the same way he'd done everything else on the mountain, by turning the problem into a task and working the task. By mid-afternoon, Cameron could cover only a few feet at a time before sitting down. Luke was pausing at anchor points for minutes, at a stretch, staring down slope, the sequential logic of rope transitions no longer connecting reliably in his mind. GPS tracking data later showed all three were moving only intermittently through the afternoon, not resting, not advancing, just stopped. Radio calls from lower on the route reported 3 climbers stranded high above Camp 4. A rescue discussion began below, but climbers returning from their own summit pushes were already carrying limited oxygen reserves and had no realistic path back up into those conditions. All 3 were last confirmed above approximately 200 feet, roughly 800 vertical feet above Camp 4, between the south summit and the balcony. Cameron was beside the rope line. Luke was at a fixed anchor. Chad was still standing, still trying. The afternoon light changed. Temperature dropped sharply as the sun left the ridge. For a climber still moving, still generating body heat, it's survivable. For 3 men covering only a few feet at a time, stopping repeatedly in open wind, it was the mountain collecting on a debt that had been accumulating for weeks. The storm intensified through the evening. Visibility dropped behind blowing snow and cloud cover. The final confirmed data from GPS tracking showed faint movement high above camp shortly after sunset. After that, nothing. Through the night, the storm held. Climbers inside Camp 4 could hear the wind working across the upper ridge, a sustained, low roar that made conversation difficult even inside tents. Nobody moved upward. Nobody could. Search teams moved upward the following morning into clearing wind and low gray light. Cameron was found partially buried beside the rope route above Camp 4. Luke was discovered farther downslope, still clipped into a fixed safety line near an anchor. Chad was located several hundred feet uphill near exposed rock along the ridge. Recovered oxygen cylinders clarified what had happened. Each climber had started with 2 standard cylinders, roughly 8 to 10 hours of supply each at the flow rates the expedition had planned. The cylinders recovered showed no equipment failures, no valve malfunctions, no regulator damage. They simply ran low. The group had burned through oxygen faster than their timeline assumed, and they'd been on the mountain far longer than their cylinders were designed to cover. Some tanks came back nearly empty. The failure wasn't equipment, it was arithmetic. Too many hours at too high a flow rate, with no margin left for a descent that took far longer than planned. Medical findings concluded all 3 men died from hypoxia, hypothermia, and extreme exhaustion following prolonged exposure in the death zone. Frostbite injuries affected exposed portions of the face and hands. Investigators determined that severe overexertion earlier in the climb had accelerated oxygen depletion and physical deterioration during descent. The final report concluded that the group underestimated how differently Everest affects the human body compared to lower altitude endurance climbs. They all spent years training to reach the summit. They never realized getting down would be the real test. It was May 19, 2016. The south col of Mount Everest sits at 26,000 feet, and if you've never heard of it, it's basically the last camp before the summit. A flat, wind-blasted plateau where the air has about a third of the oxygen you'd breathe at sea level. That morning the sky was clear, temperatures around minus 22 degrees Fahrenheit, wind chill dragging it even lower. The summit was visible from camp, and I know that sounds like a good sign. It really wasn't. So here's who Derek Savelle was. 31 years old, wellness creator, the kind of person who built an audience by doing hard things and filming them. Cold plunges, extended fasts, high altitude hikes. The whole brand was built around the idea that discomfort is a choice and most people just aren't willing to push through it. Everest was supposed to be the proof, the ultimate episode. She had summited 2 6,000-meter peaks before this, which sounds like solid experience. Until you realize the death zone on Everest starts right around where those mountains top out. She joined a commercial expedition as a paying client, showed up with her gear, her camera, and a summit speech she had written and rehearsed for weeks. A scripted speech. Who does that and genuinely thinks it's going to go fine? Now, before we get into what happened, you need to understand something about the death zone. Above 26,000 feet, your body is not maintaining, it is declining. Every minute you spend up there, especially standing still, your core temperature drops, your oxygen saturation drops, your ability to think clearly drops. It's not dramatic, it's just math. And because of that math, guided expeditions set a hard turnaround time, usually between 1 and 2 p.m. No exceptions, no negotiations, regardless of whether you've hit the summit or not. The mountain doesn't care how close you are. Miss that window and you are not getting down safely. That's just how it works. Darixa was already behind schedule before she even got to the hard part. Her Sherpa clocked it at the balcony, 27,600 feet, where she was running about 40 minutes slower than she needed to be. She reached the south summit sometime around midday, just barely inside the window, and right there her Sherpa gave her the options. Push straight to the true summit or turn around. What she could not do, what the situation physically would not allow, was stop and film. So she stopped and filmed. First take, wind noise. Second take, her buff was sitting wrong across her face. She fixed it, reviewed the footage on her camera screen, reset, went again. Her Sherpa warned her. She kept going. Warned her a second time. She kept going. By take 11, she was finally happy with it. Which makes me wonder, what exactly is going through your head on take 9? Take 10? At 28,700 feet, what are you telling yourself? She reached the true summit well past the cutoff. The time-stamped footage later confirmed she had burned through nearly an hour and a half at the south summit alone. The descent started immediately, but her body had already been losing the battle the entire time she was standing still in the cold running takes. By the Hillary step she was stumbling on the fixed ropes. Her Sherpa was getting single-word answers to questions. Not a good sign at any altitude. Genuinely terrifying at this one. Not long after, she sat down on the ridge just below the step. Her Sherpa tried to get her back up, tried to physically support her and move her, but one person cannot carry a non-ambulatory adult at 28,000 feet. It's just not physically possible up there. She lost consciousness roughly 30 minutes after sitting down. No fall, no sudden event. She sat down, and that was it. I think if she had turned around at take 3, even take 5, we're probably not talking about her right now. The Sherpa radioed base camp shortly after she became unresponsive. A second Sherpa was sent up from Camp 4 but didn't reach her before dark. Helicopter rescue above 26,000 feet isn't viable. There's nothing anyone could do from the outside. Every option had already closed. The recovery team reached her the next morning and found her exactly where she had stopped, still seated, still leaning against the ridge. The mountain had just held her there overnight. Recovery wasn't attempted given the location and conditions. Her camera was pulled from her jacket on site, memory card intact. All 11 takes of the summit speech were on it, along with time-stamped footage that confirmed exactly how long she had been standing still at the south summit. That timestamp laid out the entire sequence without a single word needing to be said. Her death was ruled hypothermia, secondary to prolonged exposure above 28,000 feet. Delayed descent and physical exhaustion were listed as contributing factors. The expedition's incident report noted the turnaround advisory had been given twice and declined both times. The case was closed. Derixa came to Everest to get the perfect take. 11 tries in, she got it. She just never got to use it. It was April 17th, 2016, and Everest Base Camp at 17,600 feet was filling steadily as the spring climbing season entered its preparation phase. 14 commercial expeditions occupied the tent city on the Khumbu Glacier, their colored domes clustered across broken ice that groaned and shifted beneath them. Prayer flags snapped in the wind, carrying juniper smoke and the metallic bite of glacial air. Early morning temperatures hovered near 20 degrees Fahrenheit, warming into the low 30s by midday. Among the climbers preparing for the first summit window was Derek Holloway, a 31-year-old from Scottsdale, Arizona, whose physical presence made him impossible to miss. He stood 6'1" and weighed 215 pounds, visibly muscular in a way that distinguished him immediately from the lean, whittled-down endurance climbers who populated base camp. His build was the product of a decade of disciplined training, a former college wrestler who had transitioned into fitness content creation after graduating and discovered that his discipline in the gym translated into an audience online. Derek's combined following across Instagram and YouTube had reached 410,000, built through bodybuilding content, cold exposure protocols, fasting regimens, and a brand philosophy he summarized as no shortcuts. He monetized that audience through supplement sponsorships, an online coaching program, and gear partnerships, and his Everest expedition was partially funded by a $50,000 sponsorship package tied to content deliverables from the mountain. The centerpiece of his content strategy was a commitment he had made publicly months before departure. He would summit without supplemental oxygen. No contract required it. No sponsor had demanded it. The idea was entirely Derek's, that oxygen masks were a crutch, that a properly conditioned body could do what weaker climbers needed assistance to accomplish. He had built months of pre-expedition content around it, filmed training montages with altitude masks, documented hypoxic tent session, and told his audience that elite conditioning was the only oxygen system he needed. By the time he arrived in Nepal, walking it back would have meant publicly admitting he had been wrong, something his entire brand was constructed to never do. Derek's mountaineering experience consisted of 3 guided climbs: Kilimanjaro 14 months earlier, Mount Rainier 8 months after that where he learned basic crampon use and ice axe arrest, and Aconcagua 4 months later, where he turned back at 21,500 feet due to weather. A retreat he framed online as a strategic decision rather than a failure. Several mid-tier operators rejected his application for insufficient high-altitude experience. A smaller Nepali outfit accepted his $58,000 payment with standard liability waivers. His primary Sherpa guide was Thendup Jangbu, 42, from Tem Village, 17 years guiding on Everest, 14 summits, a career that had weathered every kind of client from cautious retirees to people who had no business being on the mountain. He was known among operators as patient, safety-focused, and conservative with turnaround decisions, qualities that kept him alive but occasionally cost him work with clients who wanted aggression rather than judgment. Thendup supported a wife, 2 daughters, and his elderly mother, whose worsening knee condition required surgery costing approximately $9,000, a sum that made this season's income critical. His fee was $8,000, split with a younger assistant named Mingma Chawang, 26, from Lukla, working his fourth Everest season. The first signs of trouble appeared during the expedition orientation on April 19th, when the operator, Dawa Sangpo, briefed 12 clients on the route, acclimatization plan, and objective hazards. Derek interrupted early to ask whether the acclimatization schedule could be compressed given his conditioning. Dawa explained that acclimatization was physiological, governed by red blood cell production and oxygen pressure adaptation, factors unrelated to muscular fitness. Biology did not negotiate with training program. When Derek's no oxygen plan came up in discussion, Dawa addressed it directly. Oxygenless ascents had been accomplished, but overwhelmingly by climbers with extensive 8,000-meter resumes spanning many years. The Sherpas would carry emergency oxygen as protocol, and he strongly recommended Derek accept it if offered at any point. Derek responded that he appreciated the concern, but would not need it. His tone was polite but carried the finality of someone who considered the matter settled. After the briefing, Thendup approached Derek privately. He explained what 17 years had shown him, that muscle mass became a liability at extreme altitude. Larger bodies consumed more oxygen with every movement. Cardiovascular systems worked harder to supply tissue that contributed nothing to climbing efficiency, and the metabolic cost of maintaining that mass accelerated the depletion that killed people above 26,000 feet. Derek listened, then pushed back respectfully. He trusted his preparation, altitude simulation, equipment, months in a hypoxic tent, a conditioning program designed for high-altitude performance. Thendup recognized the pattern, a client who confused preparation for one environment with readiness for another, but did not press further. It was too early to force a confrontation that would only harden positions. Other climbers noticed Derek. His size made him conspicuous among people who looked like distance runners, and his no-oxygen plans circulated through camp conversations within days. A few experienced climbers noted it with quiet skepticism. Derek interpreted the attention as respect. The first acclimatization rotation began on April 23rd, a climb from base camp to Camp 1 at 19,900 feet through the Khumbu icefall. Teams departed before dawn while overnight cold kept the ice stable. Derek was strong through the lower icefall. Raw power and his wrestling background gave him balance on the ladders that some climbers found paralyzing, but the advantage eroded as altitude thinned the air. By the upper icefall, his breathing was noticeably more labored than leaner climbers, stopping frequently, hands on knees, chest heaving in pulls that produced less return than they should have. They reached Camp 1 toward the slower end of the group. Derek immediately began filming, narration emphasizing danger and physical demands. Thendup checked his oxygen saturation, 77% at 19,900 feet, within range, but noticeably lower than smaller climbers, reading in the low 80s. Derek posted edited footage that evening. The content framed the crossing as proof that elite conditioning translated to altitude. More than 18,000 likes and hundreds of comments praising his discipline. No mention of Thendup, the Sherpas who had fixed the ropes and installed the ladders, or the fact that he had been among the slower climbers in the group. The second rotation to Camp 2 at 21,200 feet crossed the western CWM, a broad glacial basins flanked by the walls of Nuptse and Lhotse that acted as a solar oven once the sun cleared the ridgelines. Morning temperatures near zero climbed into the 40s as sunlight reflected off surrounding ice, and dehydration accelerated at a rate that caught climbers off guard. Derek's large frame absorbed and generated heat faster than leaner climbers, and he was sweating heavily within the first hour, losing fluids at a rate his drinking couldn't match. His pace dropped to 20 steps, followed by extended rests, his breathing rapid and shallow, even during pauses. He removed layers as the temperature rose, but stuffed them into his pack without organizing them, the bulk making his movements awkward. He arrived at Camp 2 depleted beyond what the moderate terrain should have produced. Thendup checked his saturation, 73%, a concerning decline from the previous rotation that suggested his body was not acclimatizing on the expected curve. He recommended an extra rest day and significantly increased fluid intake, then raised supplemental oxygen again. Even using it only above Camp 4 would dramatically improve his safety margin. Derek shut the conversation down. His entire expedition narrative was built around the no oxygen commitment. Months of content had promised his audience he would do this without assistance. He framed supplemental oxygen as something climbers without his level of conditioning relied on, a crutch for people who hadn't prepared properly. He agreed to the rest day, but made clear the oxygen discussion was finished. That evening, Thendup spoke privately with Dawa about the saturation trend, the muscle mass issue, and the oxygen refusal. Dawa acknowledged every concern, but noted the signed waivers and full payment. Unless Derek demonstrated acute altitude illness or endangered other team members, the expedition would proceed as contracted. Thendup left the conversation understanding that the structure he operated within offered no mechanism to protect a client from himself. The climb to Camp 3 on May 8th revealed the full scope of what Thendup had feared. The route from Camp 2 required ascending the lower section of the Lhotse face, a wall of blue ice rising at angles between 40 and 50 degrees, fixed ropes providing security while the climbing demanded sustained leg strength, cardiovascular endurance, and competent crampon technique that altitude steadily eroded. Strong climbers typically reached Camp 3 at 23,500 feet in 4 to 5 hours. Derek required 9 hours and 15 minutes. Every weakness converged on the Lhotse face simultaneously. His heavy build burned through his calves and quadriceps faster than lighter climbers on the sustained steep angle. His crampon technique, learned during a single guided day on Rainier, was functional but inefficient, flat-footing when he should have been front-pointing, wasting energy on corrective steps when his points skated on hard ice, twice catching his crampons on his opposite gaiter and stumbling before catching the fixed rope. By the upper sections, he was stopping every 15 to 20 feet. Breathing audible through the wind, movements mechanical and stripped of rhythm. At Camp 3, Derek collapsed into his tent without helping to organize gear or melt water. Thendup checked his saturation, 66%. He explained the number carefully. This reading at this altitude, during acclimatization rather than the summit push, indicated his body was failing to adapt adequately. Continuing higher without supplemental oxygen carried near certain risk. The likelihood of pulmonary or cerebral edema increased sharply with every 1,000 feet. Above this point, and without oxygen to offset the deficit, his body would cross thresholds it could not come back from. Derek accused Thendup of not believing in him, pointed to historical oxygenless summits, and insisted his conditioning provided reserves the oximeter couldn't measure. Thendup radioed Dawa, who spoke with Derek directly. Derek repeated the same position. He was fine. The team was being overly cautious. Dawa reiterated his recommendation, but did not override the decision. The liability waivers held. Derek descended the following morning and posted dramatic Lhotse face footage that evening. The caption framed the 9-hour climb as evidence of mental fortitude, positioning suffering as proof of commitment. Engagement spiked. More than 25,000 likes. Several fitness influencers sharing the post. Nobody in that comment section knew what his oxygen saturation had been at Camp 3. The 10 days at base camp before the summit push should have been recovery. For Derek, recovery never fully arrived. He had lost visible muscle mass, face gaunt, arms and shoulders diminished by the caloric deficit that altitude imposed on a body accustomed to 4,000 calories a day. His energy was lower than when he had arrived. The fatigue persistent and sunken in a way rest could not touch. He continued creating content, but anyone comparing early posts to current footage would have noticed. The vibrancy was gone, replaced by determination, holding a deteriorating frame together. Thendup made one final private attempt. He laid out what 17 years had shown him: strong men who trusted their bodies and died, experienced climbers who used every tool available and came home alive. Supplemental oxygen was not weakness. It was the difference between a margin of safety and a coin flip. Derek listened more quietly than before, then said nothing had changed. His identity was fused to the commitment. Accepting oxygen publicly would mean admitting he had been wrong, and his entire brand was built on never being wrong. The weather window opened on May 18th. The climb to Camp 4 took 3 days. Derek moved on depleted reserves, arriving at each camp last or near last, eating mechanically, sleeping fitfully. They reached the South Col at 26,000 feet on the evening of May 18th, a desolate saddle of wind-scoured rock between Everest and Lhotse, shredded tent fabric from previous seasons, fluttering from anchors, temperatures well below zero. Derek arrived visibly wrecked, moving slowly, coordination imprecise, eyes carrying the unfocused quality Thendop recognized from years of watching hypoxia settle into clients. Saturation without supplemental oxygen, 64%. At sea level, immediate to hospitalization. At 26,000 feet, severe hypoxia and sharply elevated risk of edema with any further exertion. Thendop made his final appeal in the tent while wind hammered the fabric and spindrift hissed against the walls. He was direct and did not soften the message. The numbers indicated that Derek's body was failing to process oxygen at a rate compatible with survival above this altitude. Every foot higher would worsen the deficit. Without supplemental oxygen, he would likely develop cerebral edema, fluid swelling in the brain that would degrade his coordination, judgment, and consciousness in a progression that could not be reversed by willpower or conditioning. Given the readings and the trend, this was not an unlikely possibility. It was the probable outcome. Derek's response came without hesitation. He had not climbed for a month and spent $58,000 to put on a mask 8 hours from the summit. His followers had watched him commit to this publicly. His content, his sponsors, his entire identity as someone who rejected shortcuts, all of it converged on this single night. The emergency oxygen was there if something truly went wrong, but he would not start with it and would not accept it unless he physically could not continue. That was the line, and it was not moving. Thendop accepted the decision because he had no authority to override it. He and Minkma prepared 2 emergency oxygen canisters and masks designated specifically for Derek, adding nearly 12 pounds to loads they were already carrying through the death zone alongside their own survival equipment. The summit push departed Camp 4 at approximately 11 p.m. on May 18th under a clear sky dense with stars. Wind was steady but manageable, temperatures dropping toward minus 35 degrees Fahrenheit with wind chill. Derek climbed between Thendop in front and Minkma behind, moving up the southeast ridge in the line of headlamps that stretched above and below them. Every other climber in that line was breathing supplemental oxygen. Derek was not. For the first 2 hours, Derek held a slow but steady pace. His breathing was heavy and audible, even through the wind, but it maintained a rhythm that suggested his body was managing the demands being placed on it, at least temporarily. Thendop tracked the subtler indicators, the length of pauses between steps, the speed of hand movements on the fixed rope, whether Derek's boots stayed on the packed track or drifted toward the edges. The numbers at Camp 4 had already told the story. The mountain would now decide how quickly that story reached its conclusion. Above the balcony, at 27,600 feet, the deterioration that Thendop had been watching for arrived. Derek's pace dropped sharply, rest stops stretching from 1 minute to 3, then 5. His coordination degraded in ways visible even in headlamp light, feet dragging rather than lifting cleanly, hands moving slowly along the fixed rope as if the signal between his brain and his fingers was traveling through resistance. Thendop asked simple questions to gauge cognitive function. Responses came late, sometimes with words missing, as though Derek's brain needed extra processing time to assemble thoughts that should have been automatic. Around 28,000 feet, Derek's breathing changed in the way Thendop had heard before in clients whose bodies were beginning to lose the battle with altitude. Each exhale carried a faint wet rattle, a bubbling quality beneath the rasp that suggested fluid was beginning to accumulate in his lungs as exertion and oxygen deprivation overwhelmed his body's ability to keep the alveoli clear. His steps became unsteady, his balance shifting unpredictably as his brain struggled to coordinate movements it could no longer fully control. He stumbled twice and caught himself on the fixed line with reactions that arrived a full second later than they should have. Thendop stopped, pulled the emergency oxygen mask from his pack, and held it out to Derek directly. He told him to put it on now, not at the summit, not if things got worse. Now. Derek pushed the mask away. He said he was fine, but the words came out slurred and rearranged, his logic fragmenting in real time. He mentioned his follower count. He named a sponsor. He said something about not quitting that did not connect into a coherent thought. The cognitive deterioration of cerebral edema was no longer approaching. It was present, visible, and progressing with every minute they remained at this altitude. Thendop tried again, more forcefully this time, physically reaching forward to place the mask over Derek's face. Derek resisted, pulled the mask off with a hand that was clumsy but still strong, pushed Thendop's arm away with the reflexive stubbornness of someone who had spent his entire adult life refusing to accept help. At 28,000 feet on an exposed ridge in the dark, physically wrestling a man who weighed over 200 pounds and was actively resisting was not a viable option. One wrong shift of weight, one loss of balance, and both of them would be falling. At approximately 28,200 feet, Derek was no longer making meaningful upward progress. He would climb 10 feet in a burst of erratic energy, then stop for 5 minutes or longer, swaying slightly, his head dipping toward his chest as though sleep were pulling at him, even while he stood. Other climbers passed them on the fixed line, some offering brief words, others silent as they focused on their own survival. Thendup watched Derek's condition and calculated what remained. The distance to the summit was still significant. Derek's pace had effectively stalled. His cognitive function was declining visibly between each assessment, and every additional minute the three of them spent above 28,000 feet consumed oxygen and energy that he and Mingma needed for their own descent. He told Derek they were going down. Derek did not respond in any way that suggested he understood. He continued trying to move upward in short, uncoordinated bursts, orienting toward the ridge above with the fixated persistence of someone whose brain had locked onto a single directive and could no longer process alternatives. What followed was more than 30 minutes of Thendup and Mingma trying to reverse a situation that had passed beyond reversal. They guided Derek's hands to the downward rope. They positioned his body for descent. They spoke with the calm, repetitive clarity that experienced guides used with clients in the final stages of altitude illness. Derek resisted, not violently, not with anger, but with the immovable confusion of a man whose brain could no longer distinguish between determination and the inability to process what was happening around him. He kept orienting upward. He would not turn. Thendup and Mingma tried to physically lift him and move him downward. At 28,000 feet, with muscles depleted by hours of climbing in the death zone and their own supplemental oxygen running lower than planned from the exertion of managing Derek, they could not generate enough force to move over 200 pounds of passive resistance. Every attempt drained reserves they could not replenish. Mingma's hands were losing dexterity in the cold, his fingers stiffening inside gloves that no longer felt adequate. Thendup's own breathing had become labored enough that he recognized the signs in himself. They were approaching the threshold where trying to save one person would kill three. They did what was left to do. Thendup and Mingma shortened Derek's tether and checked his connection to the fixed line, ensuring redundancy on the clips and reducing slack so that if he lost consciousness, his body would hang rather than slide. They positioned him as securely as the slope allowed, pressing him down into the track where his weight could settle. Thendup placed the emergency oxygen mask over Derek's face one final time, checked the seal against his skin, and set the flow at 2 liters per minute. A conservative rate meant to stretch the standard Poise bottle as long as possible for a stationary person, roughly 7 to 8 hours. He confirmed the regulator was functioning and stepped back. Derek sat in the snow. He did not remove the mask. He did not respond to instructions. He did not look at Thendup or Mingma or acknowledge that anything had changed. Pushed across the ridge in steady gusts that carried ice crystals sharp enough to sting exposed skin, and the darkness beyond their headlamp beams was absolute. Thendup and Mingma began descending. Both men were experiencing their own hypoxia and exhaustion, their safety window narrowing with every minute spent above 28,000 feet. Staying meant risking the outcome they were trying to prevent, not for one person, but for 3. The last time Thendup saw Derek Holloway alive, his headlamp was stationary on the ridge above them, a single point of light that grew smaller with each step down and eventually disappeared into the darkness between them. Derek was reported missing when he failed to return to Camp 4 by mid-morning on May 19th. Over the following 2 days, Sherpas moving through the upper route found his body near the fixed line above 28,000 feet, seated in the snow in the position Thendup had left him. He was already dead. The emergency oxygen mask was still loosely on his face, the bottle empty, at 2 liters per minute. The supply placed around 4 in the morning would have run out by midday, and by then the cerebral edema had likely progressed far past what supplemental oxygen alone could reverse. His last Instagram post from Camp 4, captioned as though the summit were hours away, accumulated more than 60,000 likes in the days that followed. During the descent, Mingma Chewang, exhausted from hours managing Derek, carrying emergency oxygen through the death zone, lost his footing on the Lhotse face below Camp 3. The fall tore ligaments in his left knee, requiring surgery in Kathmandu and ending his trajectory toward independent guiding. He returned to Lukla and took work managing a trekking lodge. Thendup finished the season but did not take another client for the following year. He used his earnings to fund his mother's knee surgery, as planned. It was September 22nd, 2017, and the air at Manaslu Base Camp carried the damp, mineral smell of glacial runoff, mixed with the sharper bite of wood smoke drifting from cooking tents. The camp sat at roughly 15,750 feet on a rocky moraine above the Manaslu Glacier, a sprawl of tents arranged in loose clusters across uneven ground. Manaslu's north face filled the sky to the southeast, a massive wall of ice-veined rock and hanging seracs that dwarfed everything below it. Based on my knowledge, unlike Everest's crowded carnival, Manaslu had a quieter, more isolated quality. Fewer expeditions, fewer climbers, fewer illusions about what waited above. Prayer flags strung between cairns snapped in a wind that carried temperatures into the low 30s, and the surrounding peaks disappeared into clouds that built and dissolved in unpredictable cycles throughout the afternoon. Among the climbers staged at base camp were Brooke Kessler and Talia Novak, two fitness influencers who had arrived in Nepal 10 days earlier with matching duffel bags, a camera kit worth more than most climbers' expedition fees, and the unshakable confidence of people who had never been told no by their own bodies. And let me tell you, I like going to the gym and being active in general, but I would never even think I would be able to summit one of the highest peaks in the world on that alone. Brooke was 29, from San Diego, with thousands of followers across platforms built on transformation content, physique shots, gym tutorials, supplement partnerships, and motivational captions written in the language of self-optimization. She had the kind of physical conditioning that made people assume competence in any physical domain. She could deadlift nearly twice her body weight and run sub-7-minute miles without visible effort. None of this had any relevance above 20,000 feet, but Brooke did not know that yet, and the people who might have told her had either been dismissed or were financially incentivized not to try. Her approach to climbing emphasized personal narrative over technical development. Every ascent was a content opportunity first and a mountaineering objective second. From the research I did, that mindset showed up in every post. The mountain was never the point, and to my surprise, while her mountaineering resume was thin, it was carefully curated. A guided Kilimanjaro summit 2 years earlier, presented on her feed as a personal breakthrough, a guided Elbrus ascent the following summer, and most recently, a trek to the summit of Mera Peak, 21,247 feet, which she described in posts as her first Himalayan summit. Yeah, technically accurate, but misleading about the difficulty involved. Mera was a trekking peak requiring no technical climbing or rope work, but on Brooke's feed, the photos looked indistinguishable from Everest, and her followers didn't know the difference. Talia Novak was 27, from Austin, Brooke's training partner and content collaborator for 3 years. She amassed a smaller but still sizable following. She often occupied the supporting role in their dynamic, the quieter presence in joint videos, the one who deferred to Brooke's plans. Her climbing experience was even thinner. Kilimanjaro and Mera Peak, both guided. Talia was physically strong, a former collegiate swimmer who maintained elite cardiovascular fitness. But she carried a trait more dangerous than any gap in her resume. She could not say no to Brooke. In the gym, that meant extra sets. On Manaslu, it would mean something else entirely. Expedition had been Brooke's idea, conceived during a brand strategy session about separating her content from competitors. Mountains were the answer, not trekking peaks, but a real 26,000-foot summit. Everest was too expensive and too crowded with influencers already. Manaslu was cheaper, less trafficked, and virtually unknown to her audience. They booked through a budget operator based in Kathmandu that accepted their application based on Mera Peak experience and a remote fitness assessment, charging roughly $12,000 per person, significantly below established Western guiding companies, and the price reflected the level of oversight they would receive. If you've seen my other videos, you already know a budget operator on a 26,000-foot peak is never a good idea. Their assigned lead Sherpa was Fertemba Concha, a 41-year-old from the Rawalling Valley who had spent 2 decades in high-altitude guiding. He had summited 12 26,000-foot peaks across 5 different mountains, including 3 ascents of Manaslu. He was lean in the way career high-altitude workers became, not gym-sculpted, but the stripped-down efficiency of a body that had learned to function on less. He spoke limited English, but compensated with an ability to read clients within days of meeting them. He could assess physical capability, psychological stability, and decision-making patterns through observation alone, and his assessments were rarely wrong. Fortemba recognized the problem within 48 hours. The women were strong, genuinely, impressively strong. They carried their own equipment when they didn't need to, completed the approach trek faster than anyone in the expedition, and treated every physical task as a performance metric to be measured and posted about. What they did not understand was that physical strength and altitude tolerance were separate systems. The body that crushed a gym workout at sea level was the same body that would collapse at 25,000 feet. Altitude did not care about your deadlift. I think that's the most misunderstood thing in mountaineering. Fitness and altitude tolerance are separate systems, and confusing them kills people. The assistant Sherpa assigned to support Fortemba was experienced and competent. A younger man with 4 seasons on a 26,000 feet peak who deferred to Fortemba's judgment on client management and focused on load carrying, camp setup, and oxygen logistics. Acclimatization began in late September. The first rotation took them from base camp to Camp 1 at approximately 18,700 feet, a 3,000 vertical foot climb through glacial moraine and mixed terrain. Brooke and Talia treated it like a race, moving fast, breathing hard, their gym-trained instincts pushing intensities that burned through energy reserves. When Fortemba advised a slower pace, Brooke glanced at her wrist monitor, noted her heart rate was within her training zone, and told him she knew her body. They reached Camp 1 nearly 40 minutes ahead of schedule and posted a photo, captioned with their split time, framing the fast ascent as evidence of superior preparation. When I came across that detail, I genuinely had to stop for a moment. The second rotation pushed to Camp 2 at roughly 21,000 feet. Both women climbed competently on the steeper, fixed-rope sections above Camp 1. Their strength translated well to the mechanical demands of ascending with ascenders. Brooke filmed content at every rest stop, extending time in exposed positions, while the assistant Sherpa waited, and Fortemba watched from below with the patience of someone counting mistakes he knew would compound later. But at Camp 2, the first crack appeared. Talia developed a headache during the night. Not the mild ache most climbers experienced, but a pressure behind her eyes that worsened when she bent forward. She described it to Brooke as dehydration. Neither consulted Fortemba. The headache faded below 19,000 feet on descent, which both women interpreted as confirmations. It had been nothing, but having covered dozens of climbing stories, I already had a bad feeling about it. Fortemba mentioned his concerns to the expedition leader during a radio check. The women showed poor judgment, and one had developed altitude symptoms warranting monitoring. The expedition leader acknowledged the concern, but offered no action. The women were mobile, performing well physically, and generating social media content that tagged the company in every post. Let me put it this way. A Sherpa with 20 years of experience raises a flag, and it gets filed away because the clients look fit on camera. It made me so angry when I read this. The third rotation reached Camp 3 at approximately 22,300 feet. The altitude had begun extracting its toll. Their pace slowed, appetites diminished. At Camp 3, Talia vomited twice during the night. Brooke attributed it to a freeze-dried meal that tasted off. By morning, Talia felt marginally better and descended under her own power. Both women counted the rotation as successful. Fortemba radioed the expedition leader again. Talia's symptoms were consistent with acute mountain sickness that could progress to cerebral edema at higher altitude. The vomiting, the persistent headaches, the pattern of worsening at each elevation gain. He recommended she be restricted from the summit push. The expedition doctor examined Talia at base camp the following day. Her oxygen saturation was lower than ideal, but not critical. The headache had resolved at lower altitude. He cleared her for the summit push with a caveat to monitor closely and descend at any deterioration. It was a medically defensible decision, and from everything I've read so far, it was definitely the decision the operator wanted to hear. The summit weather window opened on October 3rd, and based on what I found during that time period, forecasts predicted 3 days of reduced wind and stable conditions. The window that defined whether an expedition succeeded or returned empty-handed. Brooke and Talia departed base camp and climbed through the familiar camps. Camp 1, then Camp 2, then Camp 3 on October 5th. Talia reported no headache at the lower camps. and the expedition leader took this as confirmation. The doctor's clearance had been correct. At Camp 3, the situation changed. Talia's headache returned within 2 hours of arrival, worse than any previous episode. She struggled to eat, managing only a few spoonfuls of soup before pushing the bowl away with a hand that trembled slightly. Her responses to Fertemba's questions carried a delay, not dramatic, but noticeable to someone who had been watching her for 2 weeks. She moved slowly inside the tent, her coordination subtly off, her hands fumbling with zippers and straps she had managed easily on previous rotations. Fertemba spoke to both women directly. Talia needed to go down. The symptoms, headache, nausea, slowed. Responses, coordination issues, were consistent with early high-altitude cerebral edema. Haze was the accumulation of fluid in the brain caused by altitude, and it progressed in one direction. It did not improve with rest at the same elevation. The only treatment was descent, and the longer it was delayed, the more dangerous it became. And I'm sure all of you regular viewers of this channel know by now how terrifying haze really is. Brooke responded with the certainty of someone who had never encountered a problem her effort couldn't solve. They had trained for this. The headache would ease with the supplemental oxygen they would use from Camp 4 onward. Descending now meant losing the weather window. Talia just needed to get through one more night. Talia sat quietly during the exchange, her eyes focused somewhere between her boots and the tent floor. But when Brooke finished, Talia looked at Fertemba and indicated she wanted to try. The words carried the weight of someone who had spent years agreeing with a stronger personality and could not find a different answer when it mattered most. That moment stays with me more than anything else in this story. Someone who couldn't find her own voice when her life depended on it. Fertemba radioed the expedition leader and stated clearly that Talia should descend. The response came in careful language. Monitor her through the night, reassess at first light, proceed only if she improved. Fertemba had heard versions of that sentence before. It meant the decision had been made and his concerns noted for the record. They pushed to Camp 4 at approximately 24,300 feet on the morning of October the 6th. Supplemental oxygen began here. Talia arrived moving under her own power but visibly diminished. Steps deliberate and slow, placed with the excessive care of someone whose balance could not be trusted. The oxygen helped her breathing, and some color returned to her face. But Fertemba watched her eyes and saw what the oxygen was masking. The slight unfocus, the delayed tracking, the way she paused before answering simple questions, processing language as though it arrived in a foreign tongue. And that right there is where my heart sank, as viewers of this channel might already know what these symptoms point to. They departed Camp 4 at 1 a.m. on October 7th. The temperature had dropped below minus 20 degrees Fahrenheit, with wind chill pushing it into a range where exposed skin froze in minutes. Headlamps carved narrow tunnels through absolute darkness, illuminating a few feet of snow and ice while the mountain's upper reaches disappeared into black sky. Other teams moved on the same route, a scattered line of lights ascending toward the summit plateau. And based on what I found online, at that altitude, the cold worked through layering systems with a persistence that no amount of fabric could fully resist, finding seams and gaps and settling against skin that had already forgotten warmth. For 2 hours, the climb proceeded within expected parameters. Both women moved on supplemental oxygen, clipping along fixed ropes with mechanical rhythm. Fertemba climbed directly behind Talia. The assistant Sherpa followed Brooke. Above 25,000 feet, the route steepened into sustained hard snow and ice, demanding precise crampon placement. At approximately 25,200 feet, Talia's pace collapsed. 5 steps, then a stop. 3 steps, then a longer stop. Her crampon placements lost precision, front points scraping across ice rather than biting cleanly. She stumbled on fixed rope, catching herself with the ascender but hanging on the line for several seconds. The coordination loss was progressing exactly as Fertemba had warned it would. And believe me, it only gets harder from here. He made the call. They were turning around. He unclipped Talia from the upward line and began preparing for descent. The assistant Sherpa radioed the situation, and Fertemba told him to continue with Brooke if she insisted on the summit, but to enforce a hard turnaround. If they hadn't summited by 10 a.m., they descended regardless. Brooke, 30 yards above on the fixed line, looked down and saw Fertemba turning Talia. When the situation was relayed via radio, Brooke's response was brief. She would see Talia at Camp 4. She continued climbing. 3 years of partnership, and the calculation required less time than choosing a filter for a photo. This part honestly just left me speechless. Talia watched Brooke's headlamp pull away up the fixed line until it merged with the other lights above and disappeared. Whether she understood what had just happened, whether her oxygen-deprived brain could process that her closest friend had chosen a summit over staying with her, is something no one will ever know. What is known is that she turned to face Fertemba, and from that moment forward, he was the only person standing between her and the mountain. Talia and Fertemba began descending. It should have been straightforward. Reverse the route, clip into fixed ropes, let gravity assist. But Talia's body was failing faster than descent could compensate. At 24,800 feet, she sat down and did not immediately stand. Fertemba hauled her upright by the harness. At 24,500 feet, she missed a clip entirely, fumbling the carabiner as though she had never used one. Fertemba clipped it for her, his bare fingers working the gate because his gloves were too bulky for precision. The metal was cold enough to bond with skin on contact. Everything I found about bare hand metal contact at those temperatures made me understand exactly what he was sacrificing. By 24,000 feet, Talia was no longer capable of coordinated descent. Her legs buckled. Her arms did not respond quickly enough to brake. Fertemba was essentially guiding her body down the mountain, supporting her weight on traverses, short roping her on steeper sections, his hands gripping carabiners and ascender handles in sustained contact that pulled heat from his fingers with every minute. He radioed for assistance, but the teams above were committed to summit pushes, and the teams below had not yet started up. Help was hours away, if it came at all. Above, Brooke continued climbing. She was moving slowly, far slower than expected, because the gym had never asked her body to function on a third of its normal oxygen. But she was moving, and the summit was close, and she had told 1.2 million followers she was going to stand on top of Manaslu. The assistant Sherpa monitored her oxygen consumption and pace from behind, the math already tightening in ways that would matter on the descent. She reached the summit plateau at 9:35 a.m. The broad, gently sloped top sat at 26,781 feet, an altitude where the human body was actively dying. The sky was clear, wind moderate. Brooke sank to her knees, then stood and began filming. The assistant Sherpa allowed her 10 minutes, then 15. At 20 minutes, he told her they needed to descend. Brooke asked for 5 more, specific shots with prayer flags, her sponsor's banner, a contemplative pose looking into the distance. Each required setup, repositioning, the careful composition that content creation demanded. And this part is where I honestly had mixed feelings. I didn't know whether to be mad or have pity already, having a feeling on what was going to happen. At 10:20 a.m., 45 minutes after reaching the summit, they finally began descending. Cloud cover that had been building to the south was already spilling over the ridge lines, and wind on the plateau had increased. So I can instantly see, just from the pictures online, Manaslu's summit plateau was notoriously dangerous in reduced visibility, broad and featureless, with no landmarks and corniced edges where climbers had walked off in whiteout conditions. Brooke's descent was slow from the first step. The 45 stationary minutes on the summit had consumed reserves her body could not replace. Her legs trembled on moderate slopes. Her oxygen was dropping faster than planned. The extended stay had burned through the buffer, and the flow rate needed at this altitude left less than 2 hours of supply. Camp 4 was at least 3 hours away at her current pace, but much to my horror, the numbers did not work. Below, Fertemba was already losing his fight. Talia had become fully non-ambulatory at approximately 23,400 feet. Her legs no longer supported her weight. Her speech had dissolved into meaningless fragments, and her eyes had taken on the glassy, distant quality Fertemba had seen twice before in his career. Both times, the person behind those eyes had not survived. He continued anyway, rigging improvised lowering systems, supporting her dead, weight across terrain that required technical proficiency from a fully functional climber. His hands had been in sustained contact with metal hardware for over 3 hours. The frostbite had progressed through superficial layers into deep tissue, a process he was aware of but could not address without releasing the person he was trying to save. Each carabiner gate, each rope threaded, each anchor clipped, cost him tissue that would not regenerate. He paid it without hesitation because the alternative was to let go. and Fortemba Kancha had never let go of a client in 20 years on these mountains. And I had to take a break during this part of the story. This hit me unlike any other story on this channel before. Stay with me through the last part of this video, but I'll warn you, it still gets worse. At 1:15 p.m., Talia stopped breathing in a shallow depression between Camp 4 and Camp 3. Fortemba checked her airway, cleared frost from her mask, and attempted rescue breaths that the altitude made nearly impossible to sustain. No response. He tried again, his own oxygen-deprived lungs burning with the effort. Talia Novak was 27 years old, and the strongest body she had ever built could not keep her alive in a place where strength was never the currency that mattered. Fortemba remained with her for 11 minutes before beginning his own descent. His hands were white and wooden, the fingers locked in a curled position he could not straighten. He descended toward Camp 4 using his wrists and forearms to manage the rope, a technique born of desperation that worked only because 20 years of experience had embedded the movements deeper than conscious thought. But this story still somehow gets worse, so please bear with me. Higher on the mountain, Brooke's oxygen ran out at approximately 1:40 p.m. The assistant Sherpa had already transferred his backup bottle to her 30 minutes earlier. Without supplemental oxygen at 25,600 feet, deterioration was rapid. Her pace halved within 20 minutes. Her speech became incoherent. She sat down on the fixed line at approximately 25,100 feet and told the assistant Sherpa she needed to rest. Her voice calm, almost pleasant, carrying the false contentment that severe hypoxia produced as the brain lost its ability to perceive danger. The assistant Sherpa attempted to lift her. She resisted with the passive, immovable weight of someone whose body had decided to stop. Visibility had dropped to less than 200 feet. Cloud cover had engulfed the upper mountain, turning the route into a gray corridor of wind and ice. He stayed with her. For 3 hours, the assistant Sherpa remained at Brooke's position, attempting to revive her, shielding her from wind, burning through his own reserves. His feet, stationary in boots pressed against ice, began the same frostbite progression that had already destroyed Fortemba's hands, cold advancing through insulation into tissue that needed blood. Flow his body had redirected to his core hours ago. Honestly, this might sound cruel, but whenever I'm covering or reading these to you, my main worries are always the Sherpas. I wonder how many of them are forced to suffer like this simply because of the circumstances of their birth. Brooke Kessler stopped responding at approximately 3:30 p.m. Her body settled into the snow with the stillness of something that had simply stopped running, and the assistant Sherpa performed the same futile assessments that Fortemba had performed hours earlier on a different slope with a different woman, and arrived at the same conclusion. He began descending alone at 4 p.m., reaching Camp 4 after nightfall in conditions that should have killed him. He arrived with feet he could no longer feel, and a face carved blank by the expression of someone who had done everything possible and watched it fail. I sat with that image for a long time, 2 Sherpas permanently broken because one person couldn't say no and another refused to listen. Both Sherpas paid for October 7th with their careers. Fortemba Kancha lost parts of 7 fingers across both hands in surgeries over the following months, the result of hours gripping bare metal hardware while dragging Talia down terrain that required 2 functional climbers, not 1. His grip strength, the foundation of every technical skill that had kept him and hundreds of clients alive across 2 decades, was gone permanently. The assistant Sherpa's feet required partial amputation of multiple toes from the hours he spent stationary on the upper mountain, refusing to leave Brooke. Neither man ever guided above base camp again. The investigation found that both women died as a result of continued ascent, despite clear medical warning signs, symptoms identified, reported, and ultimately dismissed at every level. And much to my frustration, the expedition operator faced scrutiny, but no formal sanctions. Fortemba returned to the Rolwaling Valley and took work repairing trails below the tree line, labor his damaged hands could manage, paid at a fraction of what guiding had earned. The hands that had held ropes on 12 26,000-foot summits now struggled with tasks that required no skill beyond basic grip. He never discussed the details of October 7th publicly. When asked, he offered only that the mountain had taken what it wanted, and he had not been able to stop it. It was May 8th, 2018. The death zone above 26,000 feet on Mount Everest had already seen unusual traffic that climbing season, with inexperienced climbers creating dangerous bottlenecks on the narrow ridge routes, where every minute of delay increased the risk of fatal exposure. The mountain's most treacherous section had become a highway of ambition, where climbers with vastly different skill levels competed for the same narrow weather windows that meant the difference between summit success and death. The 2018 climbing season had been marked by particularly dangerous conditions, with multiple fatalities already recorded due to overcrowding and inexperienced climbers attempting the summit without adequate preparation. Weather patterns had been unpredictable, creating shorter summit windows that compressed the climbing schedule and increased pressure on expedition teams to push clients beyond safe limits. The combination of commercial pressure and social media-driven adventure tourism had created a perfect storm of dangerous conditions on the world's highest mountain. Local climbing authorities had issued warnings about the increased risks, but the lucrative nature of Everest expeditions meant that many companies continued accepting clients regardless of their qualifications or the deteriorating safety conditions on the mountain. Bryn Castellano was 26, a social media influencer from Phoenix who had gained a substantial following posting fitness and lifestyle content. Her online presence featured daily workout videos, motivational quotes, and sponsored content for athletic wear brands that had made her a modest income in the competitive influencer marketplace. 3 weeks earlier, she had posted about watching a viral YouTube video of an Everest summit, announcing to her followers that this would be her next big adventure and the ultimate test of her fitness journey. The post had generated significant engagement from her audience, with thousands of comments expressing both excitement and concern about her ambitious plans. Her mountaineering experience consisted entirely of occasional desert hiking in Arizona, typically day trips to popular trails with established paths and minimal elevation gain. She had told friends and documented in her social media posts that her daily gym routine of cardio and strength training would be sufficient preparation for climbing the world's highest mountain. Her fitness content had focused on indoor workouts and lifestyle motivation rather than outdoor adventure or technical skills development. The highest elevation she had ever reached was approximately 7,000 feet during a hiking trip to Flagstaff, a far cry from the 29,032-foot summit of Everest that would require months of specialized high-altitude training and acclimatization. Her decision to attempt Everest had been impulsive, driven by the viral video's portrayal of summit success as the ultimate achievement for fitness enthusiasts. The video had shown dramatic footage of climbers reaching the summit with triumphant music and inspirational messaging, but had omitted the years of training, technical skill development, and mountaineering experience required for safe passage through the death zone. Bryn had interpreted the content as validation that physical fitness alone was sufficient preparation for the world's most challenging mountain. She had shared the video with her followers, adding her own commentary about how the achievement represented the perfect combination of mental toughness and physical conditioning that she had been developing through her fitness journey. The influencer culture surrounding extreme adventures had created a dangerous misconception that social media documentation was as important as proper preparation and safety protocols. Bryn had been influenced by other content creators who had attempted high-profile adventures with minimal experience, focusing on the dramatic visual content rather than the extensive behind-the-scenes preparation that successful expeditions required. Her content strategy had become increasingly focused on pushing boundaries and attempting more extreme challenges to maintain audience engagement and attract new followers in the competitive fitness influencer marketplace. Her preparation for the expedition had been entirely inadequate for the technical and physical demands of high-altitude mountaineering. She had spent only 2 weeks at a local climbing gym, learning basic rope techniques, and had completed a single weekend mountaineering course that covered elementary skills like crampon use and ice axe handling. Her physical training had consisted of increased cardio workouts and stair climbing exercises, but she had never experienced the effects of high altitude or practiced with the technical equipment required for Everest climbing. Bryn had maxed out multiple credit cards to pay for a budget expedition service, posting about her plans to reach the top of the world and document the journey for her followers. The financial strain of funding the expedition had required her to take on additional sponsored content and promotional partnerships in the weeks leading up to her departure. She had purchased climbing gear online based on equipment lists provided by the expedition company, arriving in Nepal with technical equipment she had never used in real climbing conditions. Her gear selection had been influenced more by aesthetic considerations for her social media content than by practical functionality and safety requirements for extreme altitude mountaineering. Her expedition leader had documented concerns about her lack of experience in his client assessment notes, noting her unfamiliarity with basic mountaineering equipment and techniques during the initial gear check. However, she had signed all required liability waivers and paid the full expedition fee, meeting the legal requirements for participation despite the guide's reservations about her preparedness for the technical and physical demands of the climb. The expedition company's business model relied on volume rather than client qualification, accepting anyone willing to pay the fees and sign the extensive liability documentation that protected the company from legal consequences of client injuries or deaths. Above 26,000 feet, climbers enter the death zone, where the human body begins dying from oxygen deprivation, requiring supplemental oxygen to maintain basic cognitive function and prevent fatal altitude sickness. May temperatures on Everest ranged from minus 15 degrees Fahrenheit during the day to minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit at night, with wind chill factors that could drop effective temperatures to life-threatening levels within minutes. The summit route required navigating knife-edge ridges with steep drops of thousands of feet, technical rock steps that demanded advanced climbing skills, and areas where fixed ropes provided the only protection against fatal falls. Weather windows for summit attempts typically lasted only a few hours before afternoon storms brought whiteout conditions, hurricane force winds, and rapidly dropping temperatures that could kill exposed climbers within minutes. The thin air at extreme altitude meant that even experienced mountaineers operated with severely reduced physical and mental capacity, making technical decision-making and equipment use exponentially more difficult than at sea level. Simple tasks that required seconds at sea level could take minutes or become impossible entirely in the death zone, where cognitive function deteriorated rapidly and physical coordination became severely impaired. The death zone earned its name because the human body cannot survive extended exposure to the altitude and conditions, with every hour spent above 26,000 feet increasing the risk of fatal complications, including cerebral edema, pulmonary edema, and complete cardiovascular collapse. The combination of extreme cold, oxygen deprivation, and technical climbing challenges demanded months of acclimatization training and extensive mountaineering experience for safe passage through the zone. Even experienced climbers typically spent no more than 12 to 16 hours in the death zone during summit attempts, as longer exposure guaranteed fatal physiological breakdown, regardless of fitness level or preparation. The commercialization of Everest had created a dangerous environment where expedition companies competed for clients by lowering experience requirements and safety standards. Budget operators often accepted climbers with minimal qualifications to fill expedition slots, relying on liability waivers and the assumption that guides could compensate for client inexperience. This practice had led to increasingly crowded conditions on summit day, where traffic jams in the death zone exposed all climbers to extended periods of fatal altitude exposure while waiting for inexperienced climbers to navigate technical sections. The economic incentives of the climbing industry had created a system where profit margins often took precedence over safety considerations, particularly for budget expedition companies competing against more expensive operators who maintained stricter client qualification standards. The psychological effects of extreme altitude also created dangerous overconfidence in inexperienced climbers, who often interpreted their survival of lower elevations as evidence of their readiness for the summit push. Altitude sickness could impair judgment while simultaneously creating euphoric feelings that masked the severity of physical deterioration, leading climbers to make increasingly poor decisions as they ascended higher into more dangerous terrain. The combination of oxygen deprivation and extreme physical stress often produced a false sense of invincibility that caused inexperienced climbers to dismiss safety protocols and ignore warning signs that would normally trigger immediate retreat to lower elevations. Multiple expedition companies had refused Bryn as a client due to her complete lack of mountaineering experience, a fact documented in email exchanges her family later recovered from her laptop. The rejection emails specifically cited her absence of high-altitude climbing experience, lack of technical mountaineering skills, and insufficient time for proper training as disqualifying factors for Everest participation. Several outfitters had recommended she gain experience on smaller peaks and complete mountaineering courses before attempting Everest, advice she had dismissed in favor of finding a company willing to accept her payment. The more reputable expedition companies required evidence of successful climbs on peaks above 20,000 feet, technical climbing certifications, and demonstrated competence with mountaineering equipment before accepting clients for Everest expeditions. The budget expedition company that eventually accepted Bryn had a questionable safety record and a business model based on accepting clients that other operators had rejected. Their marketing materials emphasized the adventure and achievement aspects of Everest climbing, while minimizing the technical requirements and safety considerations that made the mountain so dangerous for inexperienced climbers. The company's guides were often overloaded with too many clients to provide adequate supervision, particularly for inexperienced climbers who required constant monitoring and assistance with basic mountaineering tasks. During the acclimatization period at base camp, Bryn's inexperience became increasingly apparent to other expedition members and support staff. She struggled with basic tasks like adjusting her oxygen mask, properly securing her crampon bindings, and managing her gear in cold weather conditions. Other climbers on the expedition later reported that she had difficulty sleeping at altitude and showed signs of altitude sickness, even at the relatively low elevation of base camp. Her social media posts from this period showed her excitement about the adventure, but also revealed her lack of understanding about the serious nature of the challenges ahead. During the approach to high camp at 26,000 feet, her guide had noted in his daily expedition log that she struggled with basic equipment use, including crampon attachment, oxygen mask operation, and rope handling techniques that were essential for safe movement in the death zone. Her tent partner, another climber on the expedition, later reported that Bryn had spent the pre-summit rest period taking photos and posting to social media instead of sleeping and conserving energy for the demanding summit push. The rest period before summit attempts was critical for physical and mental preparation, as climbers needed to conserve every possible resource for the extreme demands of the death zone ascent. The night before the summit attempt, she had posted content showing her excitement about reaching the top, despite visible signs of altitude sickness, including headaches, nausea, and disorientation, that experienced climbers recognized as warning signs of dangerous altitude exposure. Her guide had noted her symptoms and recommended she consider descending rather than continuing to higher altitude, advice she had documented herself dismissing in her social media posts. The social media documentation had become more important to her than the safety recommendations, as she had promised her followers that she would reach the summit and document the achievement for their entertainment and inspiration. She had ignored multiple turnback recommendations from her guide at various checkpoints during the ascent, including the balcony at 27,600 feet, where many climbers abort their summit attempts due to time constraints or physical condition. Her phone recorded her dismissing physical symptoms, including severe headaches, difficulty breathing, and coordination problems that indicated dangerous altitude sickness progression. Each checkpoint represented a critical decision point where climbers needed to honestly assess their condition and abort the summit attempt if they were showing signs of serious altitude-related illness. During the final approach through the death zone, Bryn had fallen significantly behind the group pace, requiring frequent rest stops that consumed precious time during the narrow weather window. Her guide had repeatedly urged her to maintain the established climbing schedule, explaining that delays in the death zone exponentially increased the risk of fatal exposure when afternoon storms arrived. She had documented her struggles on camera, showing herself gasping for breath and stumbling on technical sections that experienced climbers navigated efficiently. The footage revealed her complete unfamiliarity with high-altitude climbing techniques and her dangerous tendency to prioritize social media documentation over safety and efficiency. Other expedition teams passing her group had noted her obvious distress and questioned whether she should continue the ascent. Several experienced climbers had stopped to offer assistance and additional oxygen, concerned about her visible symptoms of severe altitude sickness and her apparent unfamiliarity with basic mountaineering techniques. Her guide had been managing multiple clients simultaneously and was unable to provide the constant supervision that her inexperience required in the technical terrain of the upper mountain. The guide-to-client ratio on budget expeditions often made it impossible to provide adequate supervision for inexperienced climbers who needed constant assistance and monitoring. Her social media documentation during the ascent showed increasingly erratic behavior and poor decision-making as altitude sickness progressed. Posts from higher elevations contained rambling captions and showed her removing essential safety equipment for better photo opportunities, behavior that experienced mountaineers recognized as clear signs of impaired judgment due to oxygen deprivation. The content she was creating for her followers was actively endangering her life, but the altitude had impaired her ability to recognize the growing danger. Her followers had been commenting with increasing concern about her appearance and behavior in the posts, but she had been unable to process their warnings due to her deteriorating mental state. The pressure to create compelling content had become a dangerous distraction from the life or death decisions required for safe passage through the death zone. Bryn had been stopping frequently to film herself and document her experience, consuming valuable time and energy that should have been devoted to efficient movement and safety protocols. The social media documentation had become an obsession that overrode her survival instincts and prevented her from recognizing the severity of her deteriorating condition. Weather reports available to all expedition teams showed a narrow summit window with dangerous storm conditions expected by early afternoon, requiring climbers to reach the summit and begin descent by noon to avoid potentially fatal exposure. The forecast indicated rapidly deteriorating conditions with high winds and whiteout snow that would make navigation impossible and increase the risk of fatal exposure for anyone caught above the death zone during the storm. The weather window was particularly narrow that day, with meteorologists predicting that conditions would become unsurvivable for anyone exposed above 26,000 feet after 2 p.m. At approximately 27,800 feet, just 200 feet below the summit, Bryn became separated from her group while stopping to document her climb on camera for her social media followers. She had missed the established turnaround time by over an hour and continued climbing alone as weather conditions began deteriorating according to the predicted forecast. Her phone camera captured her stumbling repeatedly as she moved upward without her guide, showing clear signs of severe altitude sickness and complete physical exhaustion. The separation from her group had occurred gradually as she fell further behind, with her guide eventually losing visual contact during the deteriorating weather conditions. The incoming storm conditions reduced visibility to near zero within minutes as predicted, creating whiteout conditions where climbers could become lost within feet of established routes. During her struggle to continue upward, her oxygen regulator began malfunctioning, delivering inconsistent flow rates that she was unable to diagnose or repair due to her inexperience with the technical equipment. The combination of equipment malfunction and depleted oxygen reserves created a critical emergency that required immediate technical knowledge she did not possess. Her oxygen supply, which should have lasted until her planned descent, began running low due to the extended time she had spent in the death zone and the increased consumption caused by her inefficient climbing pace. Something was wrong with her breathing apparatus, but she was unable to take corrective action in her deteriorated state. The malfunction was a problem that experienced climbers knew how to prevent and fix, but Bryn had never encountered this issue during her limited training. As her oxygen supply became increasingly inadequate, Bryn's physical condition deteriorated rapidly in the extreme altitude and cold conditions. Her camera footage showed her becoming increasingly disoriented and unsteady, with her speech becoming slurred and incoherent as oxygen deprivation affected her brain function. The combination of severe altitude sickness, equipment failure, and complete physical exhaustion created a cascade of life-threatening conditions that she was unable to manage. Her movements became increasingly erratic as hypoxia affected her motor control and decision-making ability. Unable to repair her oxygen equipment or locate her group in the whiteout conditions, Bryn collapsed approximately with it 150 feet below the summit. She lay motionless in the snow, too exhausted to continue and unable to descend without assistance. The malfunctioning oxygen equipment provided insufficient flow to sustain life at that altitude, while the storm conditions made rescue impossible. The location where she collapsed was exposed to the full force of the incoming storm, with no natural shelter or protection from the elements. She attempted to call for help, but the extreme altitude and equipment failure had left her too weak to move or signal effectively. The combination of oxygen deprivation, hypothermia, and complete physical collapse proved fatal within hours. Her body was found in the same location where she had collapsed, with her malfunctioning oxygen equipment still attached. The investigation determined that inexperience with critical life support equipment had contributed to her death in the death zone. Bryn's guide discovered she was missing when his group reached the summit and began their mandatory descent to avoid the incoming storm. The guide had been managing multiple clients during the summit push and had lost visual contact with Bryn during the final approach, assuming she had turned back as recommended due to her obvious altitude sickness, symptoms, and missed turnaround time. The guide's primary responsibility had been to get his other clients safely to the summit and back down, making it impossible to provide the constant supervision that Bryn's inexperience had required. The search for Bryn was immediately hampered by the severe weather conditions that had been predicted for the afternoon, with the storm arriving exactly as forecasted and bringing hurricane-force winds and zero visibility that made any search efforts impossible and extremely dangerous for potential rescuers. Severe weather conditions prevented immediate search efforts in the area where she had collapsed, as the predicted storm had arrived with hurricane-force winds and zero visibility that made helicopter operations impossible and put ground search teams at extreme risk. The storm system lasted for 3 days, during which time any chance of survival for someone exposed on the mountain face was eliminated by the combination of extreme cold and wind exposure. Rescue teams were unable to access the area until weather cleared sufficiently for helicopter reconnaissance flights, and her body was located by aerial search at the location where she had collapsed, though recovery operations were deemed too dangerous due to ongoing avalanche conditions and the extreme altitude that limited helicopter performance. The medical examiner determined that Bryn died from a combination of severe altitude sickness, hypothermia, and oxygen deprivation caused by equipment failure and complete physical exhaustion. The investigation found evidence of her separation from the group and equipment malfunction that had contributed to her collapse. The investigation found that her climbing gear met safety standards, but noted that her inexperience with oxygen equipment, maintenance, and troubleshooting had been a critical factor in the fatal outcome. The case was classified as an accidental death with contributing factors of inexperience, severe altitude sickness, equipment failure, and adverse weather conditions. Her family pursued legal action against the expedition company for accepting an unqualified climber, though the signed liability waivers complicated their case. Her social media accounts were memorialized by her family, who removed her final posts from the mountain and replaced them with warnings about the dangers of attempting extreme adventures without proper preparation. The expedition company faced minimal regulatory consequences and continued marketing to inexperienced climbers, promoting Everest as an achievable goal for clients with basic fitness and financial resources. It was May 17, 2019. Mount Everest sits on the border of Nepal and Tibet at 8,849 meters above sea level, the highest point on Earth. The South Col route on the Nepal side is the most traveled path to the summit, winding through glaciers, ice falls, and high mountain camps above the clouds. Emmerich Pendleton was a 34-year-old fitness entrepreneur from Denver. He had gained a loyal online following by sharing content about training, discipline, and self-improvement, and believed that enough preparation could overcome almost any challenge. After climbing Mount Kilimanjaro and completing a winter ascent of a Colorado 14er, he set his sights on Everest, documenting the journey as the next step in a goal he had been pursuing for years. He trained hard, did his research, and believed he was ready. But Everest above 8,000 meters isn't just a test of fitness, it's a test of physiology, and no amount of training can fully prepare the body for that altitude. And his gym friend, Phelan Thaddeus, was 31, a former competitive powerlifter He had followed Emmerich into mountaineering over the previous 2 years, joining him on several smaller climbs. He was also the person behind much of their content, helping film and document the Everest expedition. More than anyone, Phelan believed the summit could be a breakthrough moment for both of their careers. He was quieter than Emmerich, but just as confident, and often viewed warnings from others as a reflection of their own limits rather than the challenge itself. Neither man had been above 6,000 meters before this expedition, and to be fair, that's not as unusual as it sounds. Everest attracts people from all kinds of backgrounds, and plenty arrive with far more experience in other environments than they have at extreme altitude. Everest had been Emmerich's goal from the beginning, but Phelan played a major role in turning it into a reality. After Kilimanjaro, Emmerich began talking about Everest, first as a distant goal and then as a serious plan as his mountaineering content gained traction online. Phelan saw the potential immediately. Within a few months, they had signed on with a commercial expedition operator, secured a pair of sponsorships, and started building the story they would share with their audience from training to summit. The training over the next 18 months was serious. Altitude simulation mask, weighted hikes at elevation, cold exposure, VO2 max testing, structured training blocks. Emmerich shared nearly all of it online. The results were impressive, and by the time they left for Kathmandu in late March 2017, he was in the best shape of his life. Kathmandu was the first place the dynamic between the two men and the world around them became visible. They had arrived expecting a logistical hub, a place to sort gear, meet the expedition team, and move through efficiently. What they found was a city that operated entirely on its own terms, and neither of them adjusted to that easily. Phelan filmed constantly, the streets, the markets, the equipment shops, the other expedition members. He framed everything as backdrop, the city itself, the people in it, the culture around them. All of it appeared in the content as texture rather than substance. The pre-expedition briefing with the operator took place over 2 days and covered acclimatization protocols, emergency procedures, oxygen management, and the role of the Sherpa team. Emmerich listened and asked reasonable questions about the physical demands of each section. When the operator's representative explained the acclimatization rotation schedule, the series of up and down climbs between base camp and the higher camps that the body required before the summit push, Emmerich asked how much flexibility existed in the timeline. The representative said very little. Emmerich nodded and moved on, but Phelan noted the answer and filed it away as something to revisit later. The gear check flagged 2 items: lighter gloves than recommended and a sleeping bag rated to a temperature that was borderline for Camp 4 conditions. Emmerich said he ran warm and had tested the gloves in Colorado winters. The representative replaced the gloves without further discussion. It was a small moment, but it was the first of many where someone with more experience tried to make a correction and got pushback instead of acknowledgement. The trek from Lukla to Everest Base Camp takes approximately 9 days and gains nearly 3,000 meters of elevation. It is not technically demanding, but it is the first real test of how a person responds to altitude, and it is where the Sherpa team begins forming their assessments of the clients they are going to take up the mountain. Their lead Sherpa, who had summited Everest 6 times and had been working with commercial clients for over a decade, met them at Lukla. He was quiet, precise, and had read both men within the first 2 days of walking. Emmerich was strong and moved well on the trail. Phelan was also strong, but had a tendency to push the pace on uphill sections in a way that experienced high-altitude guides recognized immediately as the wrong instinct, burning energy to prove a point rather than conserving it for what was ahead. It's a pattern at this point. The fitter someone is, the harder it can be for them to accept that fitness isn't the currency that matters up here. The friction began around Dingbosch at approximately 4,400 meters, where the standard itinerary includes a rest day for acclimatization. Emmerich felt fine and said so. Phelan said the rest day felt unnecessary, given how well both of them were moving. Their lead Sherpa explained that feeling fine at 4,400 meters was not the relevant measure. The body's adaptation to altitude happened during rest, not during movement, and skipping rest days at this stage created deficits that compounded at higher elevations. Emmerich accepted this. Phelan filmed the explanation and posted it with a caption that was technically neutral, but carried a tone his audience understood. They reached Everest Base Camp at 5,364 meters on April 9th. Base Camp in the spring season is a small city of tents spread across the Khumbu Glacier. Dozens of expedition teams, Hundreds of people, a constant low-level noise of wind and equipment, and conversation in multiple languages. For most climbers arriving for the first time, the scale of what they have committed to becomes suddenly and physically real when they can look up and see the mountain above them. Emmerich's response was to film it extensively and post a long video about the mental preparation required to stand at the bottom of Everest and commit to going up. It was one of his better pieces of content, honest about the weight of the moment, specific about the physical reality ahead. Phelan's response was more practical. He spent the first 2 days organizing camera equipment, testing battery performance in the cold, and working out the logistics of how they were going to document the climb. Their lead Sherpa conducted the first formal team briefing on their second day at base camp. He covered the rotation schedule, the oxygen system, the turnaround protocol, and the emergency procedures in detail. He was unhurried and specific. When he reached the section on turnaround time, 2 p.m., at the absolute latest on summit day, regardless of position on the mountain, Phelan asked whether that was a hard rule or an operator guideline. The Sherpa said it was a hard rule based on oxygen reserves, weather window timing, and the documented pattern of deaths on the mountain occurring overwhelmingly during descents that began too late. Phelan said he understood. He also established something at that briefing that both men heard but didn't fully absorb, that the Sherpa team were not support staff. They were the most experienced people on the mountain. They had been on this route more times than any client in the group, and their assessments of conditions and risk were not suggestions. The first acclimatization rotation took them from base camp through the Khumbu Icefall to Camp 1 at approximately 6,100 meters. The icefall is a moving glacier riddled with deep crevasses and unstable ice towers, navigated via aluminum ladders laid horizontally across gaps and fixed ropes running through the most dangerous sections. It requires crampons, precise footwork, and the ability to move efficiently while clipped to a rope with a heavy pack. At altitude, it is not the most technically demanding section of the climb, but it is the most objectively dangerous. Seracs and entire sections of ice can collapse without warning, and the route through it changes constantly as the glacier moves. Emmerich moved through it well. He was careful and methodical, and responded to the technical demands without the ego that sometimes caused stronger climbers to rush sections they should have taken slowly. Phelan struggled more than either of them had expected. The ladder crossings over the deeper crevasses required a specific kind of calm that his powerlifting background had not prepared him for. The exposure was different from anything he had trained for, and his pace through the icefall was noticeably slower than Emmerich's. He didn't say anything about it. Emmerich didn't either. Their lead Sherpa noted it and said nothing. The second rotation took them to Camp 2 at 6,400 meters, and then up toward Camp 3 at 7,200 meters. This was where the altitude began to separate the two men more clearly. Emmerich continued to perform within expected parameters, slower than at sea level, more effortful, but functional and controlled. Phelan developed a persistent headache above 7,000 meters, and his appetite dropped significantly. Both are recognized early symptoms of acute mountain sickness, and their lead Sherpa flagged them directly. He recommended that Phelan descend to Camp 2 for a rest day. Phelan insisted the headache was manageable, and Emmerich backed him up. The Sherpa made it clear that a headache at 7,000 meters was a warning sign, not something to push through, but he wasn't going to force the decision. Phelan stayed, and when the headache faded over the next day, he took it as proof that the concern had been unnecessary. He recommended that Phelan descend from Camp 3 to Camp 2 for a rest day before continuing. Phelan insisted the headache was manageable and said he got headaches all the time at sea level. Emmerich agreed that he knew his own body. The Sherpa didn't force the issue, but he made it clear that a headache at 7,000 meters was a warning sign that shouldn't be ignored. Phelan stayed, and when the headache faded over the next 24 hours, he took it as proof that the Sherpa had been overly cautious. What it actually meant was that his body was struggling to adapt to the altitude. Neither of them understood that at the time, and there was no way to make them. During that second rotation, a weather system moved in faster than forecast, and their lead Sherpa called a rest day at Camp 2. No movement toward Camp 3. Wait for conditions to stabilize. It was the correct call. The wind above Camp 2 was strong enough to make upward progress dangerous, and the energy cost of fighting it at that altitude had a recovery cost measured in days. Emmerich and Phelan were frustrated. They had been at Camp 2 for 2 days already, and the delay felt unnecessary from inside the tent, where the wind was audible but the sky above them looked manageable. Every day of delay was a day of content they weren't producing, and a day closer to the weather window closing. Phelan set up the camera. The video they recorded that afternoon was not a rant. It was calm, articulate, and framed as a candid update for their audience. Emmerich talked about the delay and suggested that some people on the mountain had spent so many years operating in a culture of caution that they struggled to recognize when conditions were actually acceptable. He said the Sherpas were incredibly valuable for logistics, route knowledge, and carrying loads, but that experience and expertise were not always the same thing. He argued that the people attempting the climb should ultimately be making the decisions, not the people hired to support it. He also said that he and his friend were capable of evaluating the conditions for themselves and didn't intend to hand over that responsibility to anyone else. Phelan added that the delay felt calibrated to the Sherpas' comfort level rather than the conditions themselves. He said there came a point where climbers had to trust their own assessment of the mountain instead of treating every recommendation as unquestionable. They brought the memory card down to base camp at the end of the rotation. Phelan edited the clip, compressed it, and uploaded it through the expedition's satellite terminal at base camp, the only place on the mountain with the bandwidth to support a video upload. It went live to their audience 3 days later. Their lead Sherpa saw the video on a phone that evening. Another member of the team had found it and shown it to him without comment. He watched it once, said nothing, and continued preparing the equipment for the next rotation. He did not raise it with either man directly, and I think that restraint, that choice to say nothing and just keep doing the job, says more about who he was than anything else in this story. After the rotations were complete, both men returned to base camp for a 4-day rest period before the summit push. On the third rest day, their lead Sherpa sat with both men for the summit briefing. He went through the plan in full: departure time from Camp 4, oxygen flow rates for each section, the turnaround rule, the signs of deterioration to watch for in each other, and the protocol if either of them became unable to move under their own power above Camp 4. He was specific and unhurried, and he did not soften any of it. He told them the weather window for their push was narrow. A system was forecast to arrive from the west within 36 to 40 hours of their planned departure from Camp 4. That meant the timing had almost no margin. They needed to move efficiently, they needed to respect the turnaround time, and they needed to be back at Camp 4 before the system arrived. Any significant delay at any point in the push compressed the margin further. He also told them that the headache at Camp 3 during the second rotation was something he had not forgotten, and that Phelan needed to be honest about how he was feeling at every stage of the push. If something felt wrong above 8,000 meters, the correct response was to say so immediately, not to manage it privately. The summit push was scheduled to begin from Camp 4 on the evening of May 17th. They left Camp 4, the South Col, at 7,950 meters at 10:30 p.m. on May 17th. The conditions at departure were within acceptable parameters: cold, dark, wind at manageable levels, visibility adequate. Their lead Sherpa went first. A second Sherpa followed behind Phelan, who was the slower of the two. The section from Camp 4 to the balcony at approximately 8,400 meters took 4 hours and 30 minutes, longer than the standard 3 to 4 hours, primarily because of Phelan's pace. He was moving but not efficiently. His footwork was deliberate in a way that suggested he was working harder than the altitude alone accounted for. Their lead Sherpa slowed the group somewhat to match him, which compressed the timeline by approximately 45 minutes against the plan. At the balcony, the lead Sherpa checked both men's oxygen. Emmerich was on track. Phelan had consumed slightly more than projected due to the extended time on the lower section. The flow rate was adjusted marginally, and the deficit was noted. The margin was tighter than it should have been, and they hadn't even reached the hardest section yet. They continued upward. The section from the balcony to the south summit at 8,690 meters took another 5 hours and 40 minutes, far slower than expected. Phelan's pace had dropped noticeably, and his movements and responses were becoming less precise. He was still functioning, but something was clearly wrong. They reached the south summit at 9:20 a.m. on May 18th. Their lead Sherpa stopped the group and told them they needed to turn around. He explained the situation calmly. The summit was still at least 45 minutes away. The weather was deteriorating faster than forecast, and Phelan had already used more oxygen than planned. Just as concerning was his condition. After hours in the death zone, he was showing signs that his body was no longer coping with the altitude the way it needed to. Emmerich said they were 45 minutes from the summit. He said they had been on the mountain for 6 weeks, had done everything correctly, and were standing at 8,000 8,690 meters. He said he was not turning around 45 minutes from the top. Their lead Sherpa said he was not, asking them to abandon the expedition. He was telling them that, continuing from this point, given Phelan's condition and the oxygen situation and the incoming weather, significantly reduced the probability of both of them getting back down. Phelan said he felt fine. His legs were heavy, but that was expected and he could manage it. Emmerich looked at him, then looked at the Sherpa and said they were continuing. Their lead Sherpa said he was formally advising against it and that he wanted that noted. Then he continued up the mountain with them because that was his job. It's hard not to respect people who do that for a living. Every trip up the mountain carries risks for them too, yet they keep going back to help other people reach the summit. They reached the summit at 10:50 a.m. Both men were exhausted in a way that was categorically different from any exhaustion either of them had experienced before. Not muscular, not cardiovascular, but a deep systemic depletion that made every movement require a separate, conscious decision. The wind had picked up noticeably in the last hour of the ascent. The sky to the west had changed. They had made it to the highest point on Earth. The descent began at 11:10 a.m. By the time they reached the section just below the summit, the wind had strengthened to the point where forward movement required active bracing. The incoming system was arriving ahead of schedule. Phelan's movement had become imprecise in a way that was no longer subtle. He was placing his feet on the fixed rope sections with a delay between intention and action that indicated his brain was not receiving adequate oxygen. On a ridge with significant exposure on both sides, that delay was dangerous in a specific and measurable way. Their lead Sherpa stayed within arm's reach of Phelan. The second Sherpa stayed close to Emmerich. The group was moving, but the pace was slower than the descent required, given what was building from the west. At approximately 1:20 p.m., at roughly 8,600 meters on the descent ridge below the south summit, Phelan stopped moving. He sat down on the ridge without warning, not a fall, just a cessation of forward movement. He said he needed a minute. His oxygen mask was still on, but his second bottle had been running longer than calculated due to the extended time above 8,000 meters, and the reserve was lower than it should have been. At that point in the descent, the lead Sherpa checked the gauge and switched him to the emergency bottle, the last one. He tried to get Phelan to stand. Phelan could not coordinate his legs well enough to stand safely on the ridge. His responses to instructions were present, but delayed by several seconds. His eyes were open, but not tracking normally. This was not exhaustion. This was high-altitude cerebral edema, the brain swelling that occurs when the body can no longer compensate for oxygen deprivation at extreme altitude, and it had been developing since at least the balcony, possibly earlier. The headache at Camp 3 during the second rotation had been the first signal. The slow pace, the imprecise footwork, the delayed responses on the ascent. All of it had been the progression of a process that Phelan's body had been fighting since before the summit push began. At 8,600 meters in a deteriorating storm, there was no treatment available and no way to descend fast enough to reverse it. Emmerich came back up to them. The wind was now strong enough that standing required active effort. The temperature had dropped sharply and visibility was beginning to close. The lead Sherpa told Emmerich directly that Phelan needed to be physically assisted down, and that doing so was going to require both Sherpas working together, which meant Emmerich needed to move independently for a section of the descent, staying on the fixed rope and moving as quickly as he could toward Camp 4. He made it approximately 200 meters further along the descent ridge before he also stopped. The hours above 8,000 meters, the oxygen depletion, the physical exertion of the ascent and the beginning of the descent, and the cold had accumulated past the point his body could compensate for. He sat down on the ridge. He was conscious, more so than Phelan had been, but he could not stand. His hands were not responding with the precision required to manage the fixed rope safely. The lead Sherpa reached him after leaving Phelan with the second Sherpa. The wind was now at full storm intensity. Visibility had dropped to near zero. The temperature at that elevation with wind chill was approximately negative 40 degrees Fahrenheit. The lead Sherpa administered the last of the emergency oxygen supply to Emmerich. He stayed with him and attempted to get him moving for as long as conditions allowed. Emmerich was responsive to physical prompting, but could not sustain coordinated movement for more than a few steps before stopping again. Above them, the second Sherpa was in the same situation with Phelan, present, attempting to assist, unable to move a person who could not move themselves on a technical ridge in a whiteout storm at 8,600 meters. Radio contact with Camp 4 was established at approximately 2:15 p.m. a rescue from below was not possible. No one could ascend into those conditions to reach them. The team at Camp 4 could only maintain radio contact and wait. At some point in the following hours, radio contact with both men was lost. The lead Sherpa made it back to Camp 4 alone in the early hours of May 18th, severely depleted, with frostbite to 3 fingers on his left hand. The second Sherpa reached Camp 4 approximately 90 minutes later, also alone. When conditions allowed a search 2 days after the storm cleared, a team ascended the descent ridge from Camp 4. No trace of either man was found between the South Col and the South Summit. The search was called after 2 days without findings. The expedition operator's report documented the full timeline: departure from Camp 4, pace through each section, oxygen consumption rates, the turnaround recommendation at the South Summit, the decision to continue, and the lead Sherpa's account of the collapse and the conditions during the descent. A GPS device recovered from Camp 4 had logged the ascent track. The last recorded position was at approximately 8,590 meters at 1:47 p.m. on May 18th, consistent with the lead Sherpa's account of where Emmerich had stopped on the descent ridge. The coroner's determination, issued through the relevant Nepalese authorities, listed both Emmerich Pendleton and Phelan Thaddeus as presumed dead. Cause of death was listed as exposure and hypoxia, consistent with prolonged time in the death zone above 8,500 meters during deteriorating weather conditions. Contributing factors included oxygen reserves depleted beyond planned levels due to extended time above 8,000 meters, failure to initiate descent at the recommended turnaround point, and in Phelan Thaddeus's case, pre-existing signs of altitude-related cerebral stress that had been present since the second acclimatization rotation and had not been adequately addressed before the summit push. For a few minutes that morning, they stood on top of the world. In the end, neither Emmerich Pendleton nor Phelan Thaddeus was ever seen again.